Hi, welcome to Lights Camera Author. I'm Jim Juno, and I have with me today a very special guest. We are going across the pond, as they say, to the UK. Catherine Curzon, welcome to Lights Camera Author.
Hello, thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Now, your new book, now in the UK, it is coming out on July 30th, I believe. And in America on Amazon, it has an August 30th release date. So, but it's called The Real Bogie and Bacall. And by the way, I like your little shop of horrors
Yeah,
plant them back there.
it sings and dances as well.
I tell you, oh, really, it does. But this new book, Real Bogie and Bacall, is about, of course, Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall.
Mm.
And I need to ask you, this is your first. Now you've had a lot of, I want to say a lot of books published. You've had a lot of books published. But this is your first for I can't get the words out here, foray into the classic Hollywood genre, isn't
Mm.
it?
It is, yeah. People always assume and quite often ask me if my sort of training and education is in history, but my bachelor's and master's were actually in film. Um, so I'm actually a film studies scholar, if you like, although I've never done much scholarship in it. Um, and I kind of fell into the 18th century history and World War II history, which is where I've carved out my career by accident. But my sort of passion has been for Hollywood, particularly classic Hollywood. So this is fantastic. This is actually sort of, I mean, my heart lies in everything I do, but this is where my heart's like sort of lied for a long time. So it's really exciting to actually finally do something in that genre.
That's right. And for those of you who are not familiar with Catherine's work, you're not just a researcher, you're a royal historian.
I am. I
And
am.
so that you've got quite a pedigree researching into the 18th century and World War II. But the real Bogey and Bacall. Now, granted, there's been a lot written about Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall. Um, what did you find that's new?
Um, it's actually there's been a lot written, and obviously because there's, as in any family, like an illustrious family, there are certain things that the families like to hold on to in terms of personal correspondence and that kind of thing, because they use them in their own work, which who wouldn't? I certainly would. So the perspective I try to tell it from is I think that when I've read about Bogie and Bacall, and this is in no way to denigrate other scholarship on it, there's some amazing writing, but there's quite often a focus on the sort of worldly Bogart. And I've sometimes found as a sort of woman and a female film historian that Bacall gets not a short shrift, but she's kind of the supporting player. So what I was sort of intrigued by is how we see in their own recollections little teasing hints that Bacall, or Betty as I call her in the book, although I know that would have annoyed her because as a friend of mine met her and she said only my friends get to call me Betty. Um, that she was the steering force in the marriage. She was incredibly stabilizing. And I just found that perspective really intriguing because certainly when I've grown up and learned about Bogey and Bacall, he was, the elder statesman of film, the older man in the marriage, obviously fourth marriage. And I just wanted to go from that perspective of her being not the parent, but almost a sort of parent to him and a really stabilizing influence who, in many ways, although his life was way too short and their marriage was way too short, in many ways kind of saved him on a number of different levels.
So they met. Of course, everybody knows the story about how they met on in the movie To Have and Have Not.
Mm, mm.
One of the most famous scenes. I mean, her character was called Slim, and he was called Steve in the movie. And the famous line of "You know how to whistle, Steve." Um, Tell me a little bit about how you found out what you found out behind the meeting of the two.
Um, when they first met while Bogey was filming Passage to Marseilles, and it was just kind of Howard Hawks wanted him to meet his leading lady because he had the power of veto. And Hawks quite fancied carving her out to be not to put too fine a point on it, as Betty herself realized later, to become a mistress. So he had this certain image he wanted to put across, this sort of sullen, sexy, knowing young woman. But he also knew if Bogie didn't like her, she wasn't going to get the part. So he introduced them, and you kind of think it must have been some sort of love at first sight, but they both recollected that they were just kind of like, oh, hiya, yeah, great, good to meet you. And Bogie was kind of, yeah, she'll be fine. And Betty was just, as you can imagine, completely starstruck. Although what I did quite like was that she'd been to the cinema to see a Bogart film with her auntie, and her auntie had thought he was the hottest thing going. And Betty had said, "Oh, no, 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 there's nothing attractive about him." But when she met him in the flesh, they got on incredibly well. And when they started filming, she was understandably just very, very nervous. First film role, and it's a starring role opposite the biggest star in the world, and the pressure of that must have been intense. But one of the nice things about Bogart, that I'm sure you know, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners know, is he was just a really down to earth guy. He didn't have any pretensions, any airs at all. And he went out of his way to make her feel comfortable. And they would kid around together. They went out on cycles around the studio lot and just became friends. And I think that obviously nowadays, sort of, we're in the era of Me Too, and we've heard such horrible stories about, people being exploited, and just awful stories from film sets. But what was nice about theirs was how their romance sort of very organically grew, and it grew out of friendship. And I think, most of us can sort of relate to that and appreciate that you don't get that massive kind of love at first sight and it's like a bolt from the blue and it's perfect. But they got to know each other. She got to know him not as a sort of hard man, the hard drinking guy who he had this reputation for being, but she actually started to see some vulnerability in him. And he seemed to be quite happy to show that to her, even quite early in their friendship. And she herself remembered that what in the end really sealed the deal was that they had shared a sense of humor. And, it's that shared sense of humor just sort of blossomed on the set into a very quiet romance. And then one night she was waiting to shoot a scene and Bogie was about to leave, and he wrote his number on a matchbook and just gave her a kiss. And that, as they say, was that. It was on.
I see a lot of people may not realize that when they first met, Bogart was actually married
He
to
was.
Maya Matho.
Oh.
And it wasn't a happy marriage, so to speak. It was, I mean, they were even known as the battling Bogarts because they would fight so
Yes.
much.
Yeah, she was his third wife. And the other two marriages had broken up because of pressures of work. And in the first case, Bogey's first wife was actually more successful than he was, quite a bit more successful than he was, Helen Menken. And they split up, and he married Mary Phillips, who was a second actress. That marriage broke up when Bogey wanted her to give up her career. She was a Broadway performer. He wanted her to come out to Los Angeles to sort of be the wife. And she didn't want that, so they split up. But they remained, both of those former wives remained really close friends with Bogey. Mayo gave him what he wanted. Mayo had met Bogey years earlier when she was a chorus girl on Broadway, and they just sort of on nodding terms. But in Los Angeles, they went to the same drinking dens, they gambled together, and Mayo could drink Bogey flat under the table. She could drink most people under the table. And their relationship, as you quite rightly say, the battling Bogarts was, I think politely we would say, tumultuous, but it was incredibly passionate, but it was also incredibly violent. Bogey nicknamed Mayo Sluggy because she would slug him. And it was written up as a joke, as kind of like, oh, it's so funny because Bogey, this sort of hard man of film, is beaten up by his wife, but it's actually not funny. And there was one occasion she stabbed him between the shoulder blades. She pulled a gun on him and he had to lock himself in the bathroom. And it got to a point where they would have dinner parties where they'd have friends over, and Mayo would launch whole plates of food at Bogey and he'd just calmly get on the floor, tidy it up, then sit down and keep eating. It just became par for the course that crockery was smashed, windows were smashed, and then they'd appear in the newspapers and say, "We're back on, we're teetotal now." But it was a battleground. It was a really bad marriage on, for both participants. It's just a really bad match.
In the book, you also write that Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall are two people whom nobody would think would get together and become husband and wife because of they came from such different backgrounds, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. I mean, I think really the only thing that they share in their background is they're both New Yorkers, which probably helped them in Los Angeles because my husband's actually from New York and they have a kind of different way of looking at the world, I think, than people from Los Angeles. But yeah, they did. Bogey was from pretty upper class stock. His father was a surgeon, but his father was also a romancer. So he talked about how his ancestors had come over on the Mayflower and had sort of like founded parts of America, and he insinuated himself into the real upper classes, where he met a lady named Maud, and he was Belmont and she was Maud Humphrey. And Maud was a very celebrated illustrator. She was incredibly famous. Um, she drew children, kind of like wide-eyed, beautiful children. That was her stock in trade. And she illustrated all kinds of things, books, advertisements. And they got together and kind of entered high life as a couple. But Bogart Sr. was an incredible traditionalist, and he thought women should be at home, which Bogey did think to some degree. Women should be at home, they should look after the man, they shouldn't be voting. Maud was a complete go-getting modern woman. So they split up. They only got back together when Bogey's dad had an accident and broke his leg and he was in hospital for a long time. And Maud came to visit him and they fell in love again. And they were actually married in hospital. So they lived a real upper class lifestyle. Bogey was at expensive schools, which he absolutely hated. He became Maud's favorite model and he became the Humphrey baby. So his face was famous as a baby. And he endured some awful tormenting at school because she would dress him up in little velvet outfits and, little frilly collars and frilly cuffs. And he wasn't allowed to do sport. He had to come back and model. Bacall, on the other hand, she came from a much lower class family. It was an immigrant family. And her dad deserted the family at a very young age. She was very young. And she was really raised by a mum. And her mum, not unlike Maud, again, was really go-getting. And her mum she was the kind of, New York gal that you'd make a film about. So she was always out working and, she didn't take any nonsense from anyone. She didn't want a man because men weren't worthy of her. And she raised Betty to basically think you can be anything. And if you can dream it, you can do it. And she just instilled a huge amount of belief in Bacall, but also she instilled in her a massive work ethic. So whereas Bogey had had a lot of privilege growing up, country homes, private lakes, private theatricals that he set up, she worked the soles off her shoes, like knocking on doors, trying to get her breaks. But yeah, one was closeted and Bogey obviously pushed against it and pushed against that kind of, no one who looked at his output, I think, would think he was an upper class, privately educated boy. Whereas Betty had the sort of class and elegance that you might think, oh, I bet she comes from money. And actually it was the other way around. But yeah, opposites attract, and sometimes I guess opposites can appear to even be the opposite of what they are.
I remember an interview, or it was maybe a documentary that Lauren Bacall did back in, I think, the 80s or so, that she, when she was told that she was going to be starring in To Have and Have Not, that she didn't know who her leading man was going to be at first. And they said it was going to be a very handsome star. And she got all excited. And then, but when she was told it was Humphrey Bogart, she went, Humphrey Bogart. Well, she wasn't that impressed with that, was she?
No, she wasn't. As I say, she didn't find him particularly attractive in the sort of leading man film star way. And she'd really been coached for a long time by Hawks and his wife, who was the original Slim. And she'd been introduced to people like Cary Grant. Later on, they introduced her to Clark Gable to try and get her off Bogie onto Clark Gable. She wasn't impressed at all. She wanted a sort of Cary Grant figure, you know, kind of what you would think of when you think of a sort of romantic, sexy leading man. And it's funny because on my Twitter, every week I do a sort of weekly Cary Grant picture. And in 2024, people still fall over themselves at Cary Grant. So obviously a certain type sticks. Some fall over themselves at Humphrey Bogart, but Cary Grant definitely, I think, wins the day over that.
Now, her part, of course, the movie To Have and Have Not propelled Lauren Bacall into a star status. I mean, she had done movies before, but that wasn't her first movie role. And what I'm wondering is the part, well, what I read was that the part was not supposed to be that big of a part until they saw the chemistry between Bogie and Bacall.
Yes, that's true. To Have and Have Not was her first movie role.
Oh, okay.
But you're quite right. The part was supposed to be because she was untested. That was the key. So they said we can't have a big role because what if she's not that good? What if she looks right, but there's no chemistry, as you very rightly say. And then obviously the chemistry exploded. Hawkes was actually really annoyed at the chemistry from one perspective because he had his eye on her himself and he did everything in his power to break them up. But yeah, as soon as they saw the chemistry, Jack Warner, who you know Jack Warner incredibly well, very powerful man. What Jack Warner's word was law. When Jack Warner saw the rushes, he was like, write her a big part. So they did whole reshoots to make the part bigger. And the funny thing about it all, of course, is that she was permanently terrified. She was incredibly nervous. We have, the famous look that came out of her not being able to move because she was shaking so much. So she just sort of clamped herself together. And yeah, I mean, it's in every way you can think of, it's a Hollywood fairy story to get that role and that chemistry. But in actual fact, it turned out for Bacall to be a bit of a poison chalice because it was such an amazing debut. And after that, as she herself said, many times, that people always just kind of thought she's not as good without Bogie, and that she herself felt that she could never quite get back to the heights of that first one. That no matter how hard she tried, that she always felt as though there was something about that had been particularly magic. I think she's a bit hard on herself because, I think she's great and she's got loads of people that think she was great. But she always felt that. And obviously then she went things like Confidential Agent that bombed and she got the blame. And it's that thing again, I think, because when someone's had, and we British do this a lot, when someone's done really well, we build them right up. But then our favorite thing is to like bowl them back off the pedestal. I think Americans are a bit better at celebrating people on their pedestal. My husband certainly seems to be. Whereas the British, we're kind of like, give her a prod. And she felt that people were just waiting because she seemed to have it all. She had the career, she had the man, she had it all. And they were looking for that little chink in her armor, which is, the next role, not so good, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Now they became friends on To Have and Have Not. They went on to make, I believe it was 4 pictures together. Key Largo, Dark Passage, and I'm drawing a blank on
Big
the last
Sleep.
one.
The Big Sleep.
Big Sleep. And but now they became friends on the first one. When did their relationship become more intimate?
It became intimate during the filming of that. They had a lot of, it was quite an intriguing one because obviously we can only go with what we think is fact, but it was intimate but not fully sexual for quite a while. It actually sort of became a full-blown affair. Bogie, Mayo became very suspicious. Mayo was always quite suspicious of Bogie's leading ladies, and she became very suspicious because of the friendship they had. And that led to, she would ring the studio and sort of bawl abuse down the phone at them both. And at that point, they were going out for dinners together and things like that. So they were secretly seeing each other. I guess that maybe we wouldn't like it if our partners were doing it, but it wasn't a full-blown affair. Then they would start meeting up in cars to sort of like canoodle. And it became an affair when Mayo finally confronted Bogie and there was a huge row. And he got completely blind drunk and he walked in a rainstorm, miles and miles and miles into the middle of nowhere, found a payphone, phoned Bacall and said, "You got to come and get me." She jumped into her car and mum was actually staying with her and her mum could not believe what she was seeing because she thought she'd raised an independent girl. She jumped into her car, went and picked him up. They went from the side of the road to one of Bogie's friends had a trailer and they spent the weekend there and that's where it became a full-blown affair and it was full on from that point. They broke up a couple of times when Mayo got basically Bogie confessed to Mayo because of guilty conscience, but they just came back to each other. They both would, when they broke up, they both became just incredibly depressed. And it was one of those things where, you know, you really feel for Mayo because she gave up her career to be a wife, but equally, no marriage that ends in physical fights regularly is a good marriage. So
Exactly. Now, a lot of people don't realize when you think of the Rat Pack, you think of Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, those
above
five.
my head on the poster. It's an
That's
Ocean's
right,
11
up there,
poster.
up on the top there, the poster
Yeah.
there. And that is from the movie The Killers. No, that's not The Killers with
No,
Angie Dickinson. Huh?
Ocean's 11.
Oh, Ocean's 11. Okay. Yeah. The Killers was with Ronald Reagan and Angie Dickinson.
Yeah.
That's what. But a lot of people don't realize Bogart was the founder of the Rat Pack, and Bacall actually gave him the name.
Yes, yes, he was. And the Rat Pack then, Frank Sinatra was in it, but it was people like David Niven, Swifty Lazar, Judy Garland, Sidney Luft. And yeah, it was just a whole bunch of famous friends that used to get together at Bogey's place in Holmby Hills and drink and party. And yeah, Bacall said you're like a pack of goddamn rats. And they became the Rat Pack. And the funny thing with that is Sinatra, of course, as again you'll know, later almost became Mr. Bacall. He was engaged to Lauren Bacall. And he worshipped Bogie, absolutely worshipped him. And when Bogie fell ill, Sinatra used to come around all the time. Some people have said it's because he was laying the foundations with Bacall. I don't think it was that. But he used to come around so often that in the end, Bogie joked that, you know, he said he thinks we're his mum and dad. It's like we can't get rid of him. But yeah, when Bogie died, Sinatra stepped in and, as you say, became, in most people's minds, became the head of the only Rat Pack they'd ever been. But yeah, it was the second Rat Pack.
Yeah, and the amazing thing is that the Rat Pack continued until they started to pass on. I believe when Sammy Davis Jr. died, that marked the end of the Rat Pack, and that was 20 years.
Yeah, it was. And it's amazing that it became, because I am a huge Rat Pack fan. I am like the biggest Dean Martin fan. I adore Dean Martin. But yeah, when I was little and first got into Dean Martin, that was my Rat Pack. So when I started to become aware of the Bogart side of it, I was like, oh my goodness, this, they actually sort of evolved out of Bogart. He's the true father of the Rat Pack.
Now, when he became ill, when Bogart became ill, a lot of people was thinking that, well, what's Lauren Bacall going to do? But she actually took it upon herself to care for him.
Yes, she did.
She became, the devoted wife.
Yeah, she really, really did. And it was funny because her career had its missteps, and there's many times throughout her career that she had considered giving it all up to just become a Hollywood wife. And Bogie, who had always wanted a wife and not a career woman wife, suddenly said, no, you can't do that. You've got to follow what you want, and you've got to follow what you want. But yeah, when Bogie fell ill and terribly ill, she put her career on hold. He did talk her back into going and doing a couple of projects, so like Written on the Wind was one. But she wanted to care for him, yeah, because she knew that the time they had together was incredibly limited. And she did. She became his nurse, his carer. and faced it all with together. They just faced this terrible thing with massive, well, I guess the sort of fortitude of a couple of New Yorkers, really. But yeah, they did. They sort of faced it to the end, and a really sad end that, again, I say, it just came way too soon. You know, they had so much stuff still in them to do together.
Now, Lauren Bacall passed away, I believe, if I get my dates wrong, please forgive me. I want to say 2014 or 2017.
It was 14. I'm
14.
terrible at dates. I'm a historian. I always have to check dates, but yeah, it was 14.
And but when Bogie died in 1957 or 56, again, I'm not good with dates.
57, right first time.
Okay, I was right first time on both of them.
You
Okay,
were.
you know, he was interred with a whistle that
Yeah.
she gave him. Now the debate is she interred with Bogart?
No, they're not together. I'm just going to check that. I am going to check that because, you know, the Bogart thing actually as well, he wanted to be cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, but unfortunately it wasn't possible to do that. They're both interred at Glendale Memorial Park. And yeah, he was buried with Forest Lawn Memorial Park. He was buried with a little whistle that he had given her on a bracelet. And there's a photo of her actually blowing on the whistle in the book. But yeah, they were buried in the same memorial park.
Do you have any of the books coming out now?
I do. I've got this one coming out. I've got one coming out in a few months about, do you know the TV series The Crown?
The Crown, okay.
The Crown, yeah. It's back in my historian persona, it's a sort of fact versus fiction, picking up what's wrong with quite a lot of stuff that's not right. And what the actual truth of. And I'm currently working on a book about the making of The Exorcist.
Oh.
So that's a bit different, yeah. And in my World War II hat, we have Wartime Wishes for the Land Girls, which is a World War II novel, which is coming out in September. So quite a busy year.
Well, maybe I can have you back when talking about the Exorcist book.
Oh, I'd love that. I'm so excited by that one. It's just, again, I'm trying to, you know, do lots of different things. I'm very lucky my publisher lets me do it, sort of indulge my passions, and The Exorcist is, there's a lot to go at in the making of The Exorcist.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, the author's name is Catherine Curzon, and the book is The Real Bogie and Bacall. You can pick it up, pre-order it now on Amazon.com and Amazon.co.uk. Catherine, I really appreciate you being on Light Camera Author today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a great time. Thank you.